Given the internet's vast and infinite reach, and given the sheer magnitude of the ignorance found upon said internet, we can all come to different conclusions, have contrasting opinions, and even spark some witty debates, some being very high caliber in the most professional etiquette, while others may stoop to the lowest common denominator and just call everyone who doesn't agree with them some sort of negative or derogatory word. Now, these aforementioned key concepts translate, if not to a T, in the video game phenomena, and today's subject will be the Metroid series. Now, I know a lot of you out there may have already put your reticles and your targets set on the comments section, ready to just blow me up without even listening to a single solitary word that I said or anything that I've defined verbatim within the confines of this video. You were going to somehow misconstrue it into some sort of hate campaign against the series. However, rest assured, ravenous Neanderthals and knuckle-dragging simpletons alike, I'm actually going to give reason as to why my opinion differs from yours. With that said, let's actually get into the meat of this thing now, shall we? Now, any gamer worth his or her own salt that lives underneath this giant yellow behemoth we call the sun would know that Metroid has become one of the most played out, overhyped, overrated experiences Nintendo has been able to shell out on their consoles. But enough with pampering my already inflated ego and downplaying the bigger picture here at hand. Let's actually look deep within the Metroid fanbase, look into the Metroid series, and dissect each Metroid game as if it was its own standalone entity and see if it could stand up under its own merit. So let's start off with the first Metroid game on the NES. Many Metroid fans from any age, any generation will come out and tell you that this Metroid game on the NES was one of the greatest cartridges ever made on any system for any time period, for any duration, that it is literally the sole focus of attention on the NES, that it is godlike, and everything that is encompassed in the confines of that cartridge is absolute nothing but the proverbial orgasm that is supposed to just burn through your retinas as you progress slowly through the game, finding expansion after expansion and upgrade after upgrade, and slowly attempt to progress to the end of the game. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand what this game was able to do with producing the formula, but when you have this game stand on its own merit, it is one of the most boring, most mundane, most tame, most bleak, most repetitive, and dare I say, most bland and vanilla experiences I've ever had on the NES. After the first hour, the game seems to lose its fun factor, and it just seems more as though you're trying to complete it rather than enjoy yourself while trying to complete it. Now, I understand many of you may be jumping on the bandwagon saying, but the game was fun, it was great back then. And sure, maybe it was fine back then, but if we're going to go by those standards, then Pong should still be in everybody's top 5 games to ever grace a home console. And there are many NES games out there that more than hold their fun factor, even by today's standards. The original Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2, Super Mario Bros., Wrecking Crew, Balloon Fight, Ice Climbers, and even Yoshi's very own puzzle game. And for those RPG fans out there, does Gemfire ring a bell? All of these games hold up even by 2013 standards. Maybe not graphically, but that's to be expected given the limitations of the systems back then, but in terms of fun factor and immersiveness, these games do it much more effectively than the original Metroid. It's on a completely different tier and echelon than what Metroid is able to do with our current standards of gaming. But moving on to Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Now, many Metroid fans will treat Metroid 2: Return of Samus like it's some rare delicacy, as though it is the end-all be-all and the heart and soul of the original Game Boy. And that's fine and dandy, different strokes for different folks. However, the way I see it, I think many people have their fanboy blinders on because they realize that Super Metroid, now that game is a legitimate contender for a great game. That is where greatness was achieved by the Metroid franchise. It had finally obtained its identity, that's how it was, that was the thing, and that was the formula for the utmost success. However, Metroid 2: Return of Samus to me is just nothing more than a mere stepping stone to get to aforementioned Promised Land. Now, it's black and white, so I can't really say that it's going to be anything graphical. The music was absolutely abysmal because it wasn't really music, it was just ambiance, but that was due to the limitations of the console, the Game Boy. We all know that. You can't come out and write Mozart sheet music when you're sitting here with a Game Boy. But gameplay, why, it was search for Metroid, kill it. Go to next area, search for Metroid, kill it. It wasn't really anything that I could really say I was immersed into due to the fact that it just seemed like, here's a laundry list of things you have to go kill, go find them and kill them. Whoop-de-doo, rah-rah-ree. The lack of music and the lack of color stops it from being immersive. Now, is all this to say this game is bad, terrible, horrendous, and just outrageously unreasonable to call a great game? No. I'd give this game a 6.5 to a 7 out of 10. It's alright, it's decent, but it's nothing to where I believe the accolades that it has gained through the internet, GameFAQs, and all these other video game community forums have given it. They've given it this title as though it sits on a pedestal that is leagues and echelons and just eons and light years above the competition where it regards to any sort of fun factor, immersiveness, or even ambiance to even set the setting to be immersed in. Since we're on the subject of Metroid 2 Return of Samus, I think I should talk about the music. Just go look up the song, or if you can even call it that, Caverns 3. Don't worry, I'll wait. Now that you're back, what do you think? A lot of Metroid fans say that Metroid as a series has the greatest soundtrack of all time. But the only games that I can really say had a generally good soundtrack would be Super Metroid, the original Metroid Prime, and half of Metroid Prime 2. Other than that, given the majority of your other games, saying great soundtrack would be nothing more than the biggest overstatement of all time. You can't say the series has the greatest soundtrack of all time and then point to less than half of the games. But I digress. We're going back to the series and looking at each game. Now, Super Metroid, I'm not going to touch this game. This game, in my opinion, is where it became the thing. This is where I can legitimately say you have achieved greatness. You took some time off on the N64, no Metroid games dropped there, but then you made a return on the GameCube. And I will say this, I was skeptical as hell when I heard Metroid turn first-person shooter. I was a little bit put off by it, but the game Metroid Prime comes out, and it was more than just a first-person shooter. It was a first-person adventure. It had mechanics that everyone loved from the old games. It had old power-ups, had new power-ups. Hell, it even paid homage to the puzzle elements of Super Metroid. You had puzzles, you had to think about things, you actually had to analyze the scope of the bigger picture, you had backtracking, it had every element that you had in Super Metroid that made that game great in this game in the first-person realm. Now, Metroid Prime, the boss fights were memorable. I remember the Omega Pirate. Seeing that thing for the first time was like, well, damn, I'm not quite sure how this is going to turn out for me. Then you have Meta Ridley. And then at the end of the game, you have one of the greatest musical scores and boss combinations I've ever been a part of fighting over there on the GameCube, especially Metroid Prime. Now, let me tell you something. That boss, it was innovative, it was fun, and it actually has replayability to where I would want to go back and fight that boss a second time on a harder difficulty, which Metroid Prime allowed you to do. So, I'm all for Metroid Prime. However, I will say this, Metroid Prime 2, yes, it was good, but it wasn't great for two main reasons. One, it was only expansive and big because they took one planet and just doubled the size of it. That's all they really did by encompassing this dark world concept that was once seen in the Zelda games. Then, you have to realize the game was kind of lazy. Look at your arm cannon, for instance. You do realize all the beams were just recolored palette swaps of the beams in the original game? Don't believe me? Go look up a few screenshots. There are a lot of things that were in the first game that were nothing more than copy and pasted into the new game. The game was lazy. The multiplayer option was pretty much just something to, I guess, bloat up the data space within the disc, because it wasn't that damn special, nor was it anything that was really innovative or really quote-unquote new. It was just, hey, let's try and do something different, but then ultimately fail as an end result. And in all honesty, Metroid Prime 2 just seemed to be more of an expansion pack, if you will, on the original Metroid Prime, for the gameplay mechanics were pretty much just a copy pasta. I already brought up my beams complaint. They brought in an ammo system which was really, really wonky and should have really never been implemented. And in that game, honestly, there was nothing really memorable about that game. There was nothing where I can really just go back and say, wow, I will remember that for years to come. The only thing that comes close is the Quadraxis battle, and that's just because it was such a giant Goliath of a boss. And the main complaint I have about Metroid Prime 2 is they recycled a final boss. You never, and I mean ever, do that. Now, I understand Ridley coming back, yeah, but he's never really the final guy. You understand? With this, however, the final boss was the exact same. When the Emperor Ing became that Metroid Prime ripoff, you hurt him the same way. You can only hurt him at the same time. You can only hurt him with a certain beam at a certain time. You can only do this. The movements were very similar, and I understand it's supposed to legitimately be a Prime Metroid, thus there would be similarities. But the way in which it was done was very half-assed. Especially there was a section where you had to get in Morph Ball and bomb within certain sections, which is just another rehash of an earlier boss fight, aforementioned Quadraxis, when you had to jump up on his head and then lay the bombs on either side. Now we're going to get to the handheld games, because I know a lot of you have been chomping at the bit to chew me out for critiquing the original Metroid, but then not even having the audacity or the nerve to jump on Metroid Zero Mission. Now, in my opinion, what I see out of Zero Mission is nothing more than trying to emulate the success of past accolades within Super Metroid. Yes, Metroid Fusion and Super Metroid have similarities, as does Zero Mission with Super Metroid. It seems though we made Super Metroid, it was good, it was great, let's just try to emulate what we did back then, although I know you want to argue semantics, I understand it's a different video game company, so don't jump on the whole Wii thing too seriously. But enough with the digressing, back to what I was saying. They done what they did with Super Metroid, let's translate what made those elements great to these games. But there was nothing about those games that legitimately were of their own merits, of their own standalone mechanics that made you say, this game is great. The remake of Zero Mission came the closest to being great, for it did have new mechanics, it did have a sense of immersiveness, you felt powerless without her suit, so she was in the Zero Suit mode, obviously, without having, her power suit. She's going through all this trouble, you actually feel as though, wow, these space pirates are pretty badass. They took my suit, and now I'm powerless to do anything about it. And that right there is a key element of the game. However, with Metroid Fusion, it lacked that. It always seemed as though you were just a set piece being used to achieve a greater means that you wouldn't even be informed of until really Other M and really explaining the whole core character development of Mr. Adam Malkovich. Now, I'm not saying that the handheld games here are bad either. I just think they're okay. Now, I will say Zero Mission, in my opinion, is a way above average game due to the simple fact that it kept such a mystique about it. It fulfilled its niche to a T, and it seemed to do everything that any Metroid fan could possibly ever ask of a Metroid game to do. However, Metroid Fusion, it had such linearity. Yeah, you could sequence break here and there, but it would be nothing that would really change the dynamic scope of the game, unless you did some weird, glitching through the game wall or something like that, which we shouldn't even be counting if we're talking about standing up on its own merit, because mainly we're talking about first playthroughs and first experiences. But with that said, there was one thing that I would have loved if the game did it, well. And that is the introduction of the SAX, or the Samus Aran X. Now, that thing was pretty cool. It had this thing where it was like, wow, you do not want to mess with it. You can't mess with it. You can try, but you will die. It would have been a really cool element, a really cool thing about the game had it not been so watered down with, listen to the computer. Go here. Do this task. Hey, I'm the computer. Here's what I want you to do. Take out my laundry, Samus. Oh, the sax is here. Look out, it's somewhere in the area. It doesn't have that shock value anymore, especially when you see it over and over and over again. But moving past that, I think it's time we get to the big one. Metroid Other M. Now, that game was decent. It wasn't good by any stretch of the term, but it was decent due to the fact that its gameplay and core essentials were good. It had what everybody would expect from Team Ninja, with its 3D movement system and somehow trying to keep intact the puzzle elements that Metroid is known for. Since this game was on the Wii, going into it, we knew this wasn't going to be some sort of graphical pariah that everyone will be critically acclaiming for the next 10 years. But with all that said, what pushes this game off the cliff? What pushes this game off the top of the mountain into the depths of the abyss of the worst games of all time? It's none other than its god-awful, schlockish jumping the shark story. Have not once, not ever, seen a game that directly contradicts what another game has said. I remember in Metroid Fusion, that computer talked up Adam Malkovich, the perfect military mind. Now, it's funny how he's the perfect military mind, the creme de la creme of military excellence, yet somehow, all it takes is one double-crosser to destroy the whole mission. The double-crosser in Other M wasn't even important enough for Other M to clearly, definitively say, this is the double-crosser, this is the man to blame for your problems. No. Then you have one of the most egregious, asinine, and ass-backwards programmed final boss fights in the history of anything. You don't even get to beat Ridley in this game. This game literally just taunts you with everything that it could have been, and then makes it everything that it should have never even come close to even being thought of being. You pretty much turned Samus from being what Metroid fans believe to be the no crap taking, always doing what needs to be done for the greater good, ass kicking machine known as Samus Aran, and turn her into pretty much the stable housewife. Yes, sir, I understand, sir. I'll be happy to take care of that for you, sir, type of person. And personally, within the Metroid universe, I don't think Samus ever needs to be that. Ever. So all in all, the whole Metroid franchise as a whole does have some greatness within it. But to sit here and say that Metroid is the greatest thing of all time, like a lot of Metroid fans that I personally know will say, I gotta say, get something checked. Get your psyche checked and go out and play a game that consistently holds a level of excellence.